An estimated 200,000 people have died in the 4.5-year-old civil war in Syria, but no one knows for sure. The UN estimates the refugee population at a staggering 12 million people. The spread of ISIL into Syria, together with al-Qaeda's presence into the country, has made matters worse. Russia's increasing military and diplomatic support for President Bashar al-Assad and US opposition to his rule are complicating the situation. So, what can be done to end the bloodshed in Syria? Later, we'll have perspectives from Syria and Russia. But first, joining me in the studio is Flynt Leverett. He is a professor of international affairs at Penn State and author of Inheriting Syria, Bashar's Trial by Fire, and also Going to Tehran, Why America Must Accept the Islamic Republic of Iran. Flynt, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
What do you make of the Russian military deployment in Syria?
I think it is in many ways a predictable response to the United States and Turkey this summer reaching what many people saw as the basic outlines of an understanding for establishing a no-fly zone, a safe zone inside Syria along Syria's border with Turkey. Turkey has been wanting this for a long time. The United States has been reluctant, but apparently in return for Turkey agreeing to let U.S. forces fly out of the Incirlik air base in Turkey to conduct missions against Islamic State targets, the Obama administration expressed support for creating this kind of what the Turks would call a humanitarian zone inside Syria. This basically presented Russia with the prospect of NATO planes flying missions over Syria and even having NATO troops on the ground in Syria as part of this humanitarian zone. The Russians already think that the U.S. and Turkish role in Syria has been very, very unhelpful, to say the least, in fueling this conflict there. And I think from a Russian perspective, the prospect of NATO forces becoming directly involved in Syria represented an unacceptable escalation. And so Russia has moved to try and block that.
Right. Russia has troops and combat aircraft in Syria right now. Will Russia be involved in combat?
I think that's unclear at this point. There are some initial reports which suggest that Russian troops are at the very least playing a very close to the front advisory role in some instances. I don't know if we have clear evidence yet that Russian military units as units are fighting in Syria, but it certainly does represent a step up in Russian involvement in the conflict.
Right. Is it likely that the Russian deployment will tip the balance of the war in favor of government forces?
You know, I have thought since the beginning of this conflict, and have said since this started in the spring of 2011, that President Assad was not going to be overthrown by Syrians. From the beginning of this conflict until the present day, he retains the support of more than half of Syrian society. The opposition has never represented anywhere close to a majority of Syrians, and in fact now, because of externally supported and facilitated foreign fighters, the opposition is increasingly dominated by non-Syrian elements. And so I don't think that President Assad is going to collapse. I don't think he's going to be overthrown. I think that what the Russians are doing is signaling to the United States and some of its partners like Turkey that if you're going to become more directly involved in this fight than you already are, there are going to be increased costs and risks with that.
You know, there have been murmurings of discontent from the United States and its allies over the Russian deployment in Syria. But can the United States and its allies really level any kind of criticism, seeing that they've done very little to stop this?
Yeah, I mean, they certainly are leveling criticism, but you know, the irony is very high when they do so. You know, if you look at how this conflict started, you had localized protests in Syria that, from the beginning, contrary to the Western media narrative, from the beginning had violent armed elements as part of the protests. And then from the beginning, you had external powers, the United States, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, for various reasons deciding for their own geopolitical ambitions that this was a good occasion to try and overthrow the Assad government in Syria. For the United States and Saudi Arabia, it was about weakening Iran's position. For Turkey, it was about promoting Turkey's friends in the Muslim Brotherhood to gain greater influence in an important Middle Eastern country like Syria. But those ambitions have failed, and by continuing to fuel this conflict, by continuing to support these opposition elements, many, as I said, not Syrian, all that the United States and its partners are doing is prolonging this conflict, prolonging the suffering of the Syrian people, and blocking the pursuit of a real sustainable political solution.
You know, there is a military term that we often hear called mission creep. This is where you start out with a small group of people, military group in a country. They start off normally as advisors, and suddenly it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Can Russia fall victim to mission creep?
It's always possible, but I don't think that's very likely. I think the Russians, for their own reasons, are likely to be careful, be on guard about that. Also, as I said, I'm not one who thinks that the Assad government is in imminent danger of collapse. I don't think that's a very likely scenario. And so, you know, for Russia, I think it's more about signaling the United States, signaling other external partners. I think it's about showing that if you want to be serious about fighting the Islamic State in Syria, you need to be working with the Syrian government, not trying to overthrow the Syrian government. I think it's primarily about that kind of strategic signaling.
Is that the Russian endgame, getting the West involved in negotiations directly with Assad?
Yes, I believe it is. I think from the beginning of this conflict, the parties that are routinely identified as in the West as propping up Bashar al-Assad, whether it's Russia, whether it's Iran, whether it's even to a lesser degree China, these countries have said from the beginning the only solution is a political solution, and it's going to have to be based on some kind of power sharing among constituencies in Syria that support the government and constituencies that have grievances against the government. But you can't get there by stipulating before you even sit down at the table that President Assad must go, that the Syrian government has to effectively dissolve itself. You know, if at some point in the future, in a real election, the Syrian people decide that they don't want President Assad anymore, for Russia, for Iran, even according to his own statement, for President Assad, that's fine. But you can't demand that up front and hope to have any kind of meaningful political process. And I think that is very, very much the Russian endgame, the Iranian endgame in Syria.
Now, of course, this civil war has had huge consequences inside the country for the Syrian people. It's precipitated a massive refugee crisis, tens of thousands of people fleeing the country. Let's listen to what President Assad said about that.
Regarding the refugee crisis, actually it's like the West now is crying on the refugees with one eye and aiming at them with the machine gun with the second one, because actually those refugees left Syria because of the terrorism.
So is he blaming that crisis totally on what he calls terrorism?
This is clearly the way that President Assad wants to frame this conflict, that it has basically come down to a conflict between him and his government, a kind of secular government in governing this multi-ethnic, multi-confessional society, versus this very, very sectarian, very extremist, very violent set of groups, whether it's the Islamic State or the al-Qaeda affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra, that have come to dominate the opposition. This narrative obviously serves Assad's interests and his agenda in important ways, but it actually also is, to a very considerable degree, increasingly consistent with on-the-ground reality.
One other development, and that is the UN Special Envoy for Syria, Staffan de Mistura, has announced a new initiative, a new peace initiative. At this stage, what he's done is he announced the heads of 4 working groups that will hopefully talk to both sides, bring them closer, see if there could be a negotiated settlement. What are the chances of that succeeding?
I hope I'm wrong, but I'm not very optimistic about where this process could go. I know at least a couple of the working group heads that Mr. Mistura appointed. They're very, very capable, very knowledgeable people. But I think it's very, very difficult for this process to get any traction until you create a strategic environment in which all of the major external players are committed to the idea that you need a negotiated political settlement and that you can't get there by demanding before the fact that President Assad and his government leave the scene, that they are essential to any kind of future political stability, much less to any sustained improvement in the security situation vis-a-vis the Islamic State in that part of the Middle East. And right now, unfortunately, the United States, Turkey, Saudi Arabia still remain, I think, very substantially committed to the idea that even though in the US case they say we want to fight the Islamic State, we somehow want to do it without engaging the Syrian government in a serious way. That's incoherent, but I think until the United States and some of its partners modify their approach to this region, it's going to be very difficult to have a climate in which something like Mr. de Mistura's process could get some real traction.
Now, of course, the UN is just about to head into its annual General Assembly. There will be international leaders in New York for this. President Putin will be addressing the General Assembly. Is it likely that he's going to bring this up in his speech?
I think this is likely to be a major theme in his speech, that the world needs to get serious about fighting the kind of violent Sunni jihadi extremism embodied in the Islamic State, that Syria is perhaps the leading front in that struggle right now, and that Russia, as he will present it, is leading the way in trying to forge a coalition of actors that is really serious about fighting the Islamic State and will be trying to, by contrast, portray the United States and some of its partners as not really that serious about fighting the Islamic State, because if they were serious, they would have a different policy in Syria.